Thank you all for joining us today. I want to welcome those of you who have been with us before, but I especially want to welcome all the new people that have joined into this webinar. We're very excited to have you, and we are very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss the importance of Alzheimer's disease. My name is Bob Maley, and I'm the founding president of the Gladstone Institutes. Now I'm the president emeritus, and actually more importantly, I'm now back in the lab studying Alzheimer's disease. But let me begin by just telling you a little bit about the Gladstone Institutes. We started about 40 years ago. 7 people joined me in this endeavor. And now there are almost 500 individuals focusing their attention on the research that goes on at Gladstone. Gladstone is a nonprofit biomedical research institute located at Mission Bay in San Francisco. Now we're affiliated and we collaborate closely with the University of California, San Francisco. However, we're administratively independent. We have our own facility and we run our own research programs. Our research at Gladstone is disease-oriented. In fact, our motto is science overcoming disease. We work in 4 of the most important disease areas facing humankind. Neurological disease that we'll talk a lot about today, but also cardiovascular disease, including stem cell biology and regenerative medicine. Virology and immunology is one of our major focuses also, and of course now that is involving us in the COVID-19. Our scientists are committed and have a passion for contributing to the cures and prevention of these important diseases. Today's program focuses on scientists working in the Gladstone Institute of Neurological Diseases. The Institute has 11 labs focusing on neurodegenerative disorders, including primarily Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, but also Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, multiple sclerosis, and other challenging brain disorders like epilepsy and autism. There's a common thread among all of these disorders, and that is that nerve cells throughout the brain in various regions fail to function normally. And in fact, those nerve cells die. How does this occur? There are common pathways, different diseases, the same result. And this broad approach is providing important clues, allowing us to identify therapeutic interventions that could affect multiple conditions. Now, specifically, let me talk about our research in Alzheimer's disease. The Gladstone Institute of Neurologic Disease is the only research institute, in my knowledge at least, that broadly attacks Alzheimer's disease by investigating the major risk factors and the most important genes involved in Alzheimer's disease. There are many organizations around the country that study Alzheimer's disease, and that's terribly important, but they tend to focus on only one aspect. For us, we believe that the only way that we will, in fact, impact this devastating disease is this broad approach. Alzheimer's disease is a complex disease and it requires multiple shots on goal. And we're doing our very best to attack this disease from multiple aspects. Now, my own research focuses on a protein called ApoE. In fact, I've studied this protein my entire scientific career from its initial description. I hate to say, but that was 50 years ago. And you're going to hear from Leonard Tmuki, one form of ApoE, that form, the abnormal form called ApoE4, is in fact the major genetic risk factor. And you'll hear from Leonard that importantly, ApoE4, and unfortunately, is not rare in the human population. 1 out of 4 of us on this webinar do in fact have at least 1 copy of E4. And furthermore, when you look at all patients with Alzheimer's disease, we find that 65, 75%, maybe even 80% carry at least 1 copy of this protein E4. It is a major factor. You'll hear about this, and you'll hear about the exciting work looking at other mechanisms from Leonard in a few minutes and others. Now, we're very pleased today that the program is being sponsored by Kensington Place, a memory care community in Redwood City. The Kensington Senior Living Organization has 7 locations, coast to coast in the United States. And today, the executive director of Kensington Place, Joanne Hubbard, is with us. And I can tell you that from my discussions with her in the past few weeks, I am quite impressed. I'm quite impressed with what they're doing. Their passion for excellence in the care of the patients resonates very much with the goals of the Gladstone for Excellence. In addition, Susan Evans is here with us today, and her father has been at Kensington for the past 4 years, and you're going to hear from her the challenges of caregivers and the struggles, in her case, as a daughter, to provide the best care possible. Now, our speakers today include Dr. Leonard Mucke. Leonard is a world-renowned neurologist and neuroscientist. He founded the Gladstone Institute of Neurological Disease 22 years ago. We were able to get Leonard away from the Scripps Institute to come to the Gladstone. And at that time, he was actually a very young man. His main research focuses on the understanding of the many causes that contribute to Alzheimer's disease and to match the complexity of this disorder with multi-pronged therapeutic approaches. And we do, in fact, have truly a young investigator, and that's Melanie Das, who's with us today, a scientist who decided to pursue her postgraduate training after her PhD at the Gladstone to help unravel the intriguing roles of immune cells and brain inflammation in Alzheimer's disease. One of the goals of the Gladstone is to train the next generation of young scientists, and you're going to meet one today, one of the best. And then on our panel of speakers is Susan Evans. I've already mentioned Susan. She's a patient advocate. She has a passion for the research that's going on that's going to lead to a cure, but she also has a passion for improving the lives of those who unfortunately have lost one of the true meanings of life, and that's our memories. Now, I should mention that this webinar is being recorded. We will send a link to everyone who has signed up, and we hope that you might want to rewatch it, but we're really hopeful that you will send it to others who might be interested in what's going on in Alzheimer's disease. And you will receive that in the next few days. The presentations that you will hear now have been structured to try to answer some of the questions that you all have posed. And at the end, however, we will have a time for a few of those questions. Now, I would like for the panelists then to join us and to give a brief introduction of their connection to Alzheimer's disease. And I might suggest that Susan, you start, and then Melanie, and then Leonard will complete that introduction and go into the slide presentation.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here and to work with the Gladstone Institutes. I feel honored to be a part of this webinar, so thank you. My father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 8 years ago, and literally my life was turned upside down My husband and I had just become empty nesters, and it felt like overnight I went from being a daughter to a caregiver, worried about my father and the progression of the disease, and really worried about my dear mother who lost her partner in life. No one can advise you what to expect because Alzheimer's progresses at different rates. I've really devoted my time to Alzheimer's to advocate, to help others in the community as caregivers, to help educate the community, and to raise much needed money for research. We must find a cure. In the US alone, there are 5.8 million individuals diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and with an average of 5 caregivers per person, that's 29 million caregivers. Worldwide, with 44 million people living with Alzheimer's, that's 220 million caregivers. And there is a new diagnosis every 65 seconds. So together, I am here today to partner with Gladstone Institutes and Kensington to help find a cure and to fight together. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was a great introduction. I'm Melanie. I am a scientist here at the Gladstone Institutes. Like our panel today, and many of you in the audience, I have also witnessed Alzheimer's disease and dementia firsthand as it affected my grandparents. Like you, I'm also eager for effective therapies. So when I completed my PhD training 4 years ago, I came to Gladstone specifically to train under Leonard and to research Alzheimer's disease. My goal is to eventually become an independent investigator and launch my own research lab focusing on understanding the role of immune cells in Alzheimer's disease. And that's something I would like to talk to all of you today. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm Leonard Mucki. It's a great pleasure, and I really thank the Kensington Place folks for supporting this event and for all they do. I appreciate it both from a personal perspective and a professional perspective, since I was a teenager when my grandfather came down with Alzheimer's disease, and we took care of him at home until he died. And this was really a great challenge for the whole family, but particularly for my mother, I would say. And so I saw what is involved in trying to keep somebody at home dealing with this disease, the nightly disruptions, all the problems. And that experience, I think, also shaped my thinking as I went to medical school. It was very clear to me that I wanted to work on cognitive disorders, and particularly on Alzheimer's disease, because of this very formative experience that I had as a young person. And so I think, this is a very, very challenging, a formidable condition, very powerful indeed, and as you will hear, very complicated. So I've devoted really much of my career to fighting it. And we've developed, as Bob alluded to, a very diverse research program, because even 20 years ago, we realized that this was such a complicated illness that it was unlikely to be conquered by a single blockbuster drug that would take care of everything. So I think diversification of the drug development portfolio will be a key message that will come out of this presentation. And as Bob said, many of the labs in the institute that I direct here are focused squarely on Alzheimer's disease, which is the most frequent form of dementia, but there are other dementias we work on, like dementia with Lewy bodies or frontotemporal dementia. And it is important to differentiate among them because they have a different trajectory, a different response to some therapeutics, and probably in the long run will require very different strategic approaches. So let me go right into the presentation to really, highlight some of the things that you've already heard Susan mention and Bob mentioned. So the main mission of our institute really is to preserve and repair the fragile brain structures that, in my view, harbor the very essence of who we are. We all want to control our lives, our movements, our thoughts. We want to share memories with loved ones. And the diseases that we tackle, and those are listed on the right side here in the slide, they rob us of those functions that we hold dear. And so we want to block them. And we do that by combining many interdisciplinary scientific approaches. And we also look for a crosstalk among these conditions. What can what do they have in common, and can we identify key nodes that might be targeted? So we work on literally all the conditions that you see here on the right side, but a key focus for us remains Alzheimer's disease, and I can assure you that my colleagues and I will not stop and rest until better options are available. In fact, the challenge is formidable. You heard Susan speak about the numbers. These are already a little outdated, but in the US, clearly there are more than 5 million people with Alzheimer's disease, and this is predicted to skyrocket by 2050. Worldwide, many more, and the cost of the condition is really staggering. So this is in the US alone, over $200 billion a year, and clearly, if this trend is allowed to materialize by 2050, this can easily bring down our healthcare system. And interestingly, as you can see on the right side here, this shows you the causes of death between 2000 and 2017, and the investments that have been made into cancer research, into heart research, into HIV research. You can see here on the right side the graph that I was describing. Again, here are the numbers on the left, and here you can see this large increase in people dying with and from Alzheimer's disease, whereas in other conditions, some headway has been made. Now, why is it so hard to treat Alzheimer's disease? And this here is a peek into a brain of an Alzheimer person, showing you all the things that are going on. And so I will take this apart for you and talk about these different components one at a time to make it a little bit clearer. So if we focus first on the amyloid protein, so these are sticky proteins. Every one of us makes the A-beta peptide or amyloid peptide shown here, but we also have very powerful enzymes that turn them over and degrade them, get them out of the brain. But what happens in Alzheimer's disease is that either too much of this peptide is made or too little is degraded because of failing metabolism. And so it accumulates in the form of these amyloid plaques or in these smaller assemblies that erode the connections between nerve cells. And the treatments that we currently have are aiming to preserve the communication between the nerve cells that are still there. And that is true for drugs like Aricept or Namenda. They try to prevent the effects of these toxic factors or to promote the communication between the cells that are still left behind. But they don't really get at the key cause of it. And I think there's a lot of evidence that amyloid proteins are driving the process. So we've seen a large number of anti-amyloid drugs enter clinical trials. They have not done too well so far. And we need to understand why that is. I still find it actually almost unthinkable that amyloid doesn't contribute to the disease, but it may just be one of multiple things. And so what else is there to worry about? Well, there is neurofibrillary tangles, which are made up of tau, and they accumulate inside the nerve cells, and they can also exist in these other forms that float around both outside of the cell and exist inside of the cell, probably also exerting some toxic effects. There is the protein that Bob has worked on for decades, which is the main genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, ApoE4. So just like there is good and bad cholesterol, there is good and bad ApoE, and the E4 is the bad player. And as Bob pointed out, actually is quite frequent. About 20 to 25% of our population has at least one copy that makes this protein. It's been shown to really promote the accumulation of the amyloid, but Bob and Yadong and others in the Institute have shown that it can also become abnormally fragmented and impair the mitochondria that make the energy inside neurons. So that's another alternative mechanism by which this particular protein can act. Now, Interestingly, there is a protein called alpha-synuclein that also accumulates in about 60% of people with Alzheimer's disease. It's more notoriously associated with Parkinson's disease and is a key player in dementia with Lewy bodies. And these dementias and diseases often overlap to some extent. There are some interesting efforts also to target alpha-synuclein and to target tau. And Bob and Yadong are working on targeting ApoE4. So these are really therapeutic strategies, new ones that target these upstream factors, and they are very important to pursue. Now, we've shown that certain cells that support neurons, astrocytes, respond very strongly to the accumulation of these bad behaved proteins, and in that process, end up actually impairing memory functions because they become overactivated. And this is also true for cells called microglia that Melanie studies and will tell you about. Katerina Akasoglu in our institute recently showed that leakage of certain blood products like fibrin can activate these microglia, and that triggers them to pour out toxins onto neurons and damage them in this way. So this kind of bad brain inflammation is another thing that needs to be dealt with. And just as Bob said, many research programs have put all their efforts and money down on one or two of these players, but we believe very strongly that one really has to look at this disease in its totality and probably go after many of these different components. Now, people often ask, so, why do these things happen? Why do they accumulate? And from what we can tell, genetics is a very important driver. This is a complicated graph, but worth looking at for a bit. At the bottom here, you can see the frequency of certain genes in the population from very rare to very common. And up on this axis is the impact it has on the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. So you can see that there are here 3 genes, APP, presenilin 1 and 2, that are quite rare in mutated form. But if you have a mutation in these genes, your chances of getting Alzheimer's disease are almost 100%. Whereas there are rare forms, more frequent forms of genes that increase the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease a little bit, but if you've got a whole bunch of them, your risk can increase also. Now, notably, ApoE is kind of both. It's quite frequent, and it has a pretty strong impact. And there are some other players like TREM2 that you'll hear more from Melanie about later on, that are also in that category and very interesting. Now, the impact of ApoE is really very striking. It towers over all the other genetic risk factors. Here you can see a normalized risk of 1, just relative risk of getting Alzheimer's disease in men and women that have 2 ApoE3 genes. And then what happens if you inherit 1 ApoE4 gene, it impacts women more than men. And if you have 2 ApoE genes, both men and women have a more than 10-fold higher risk of coming down with Alzheimer's disease around the age of 60. Now, I'll let Bob say a few words about the work that Gladstone and he and his colleagues have done, revealing how ApoE contributes to Alzheimer's disease. Bob, do you want to make a few comments about this?
I've been working on ApoE my entire career. And when we started working on ApoE at the Gladstone, we were working on it because it had a role in cardiovascular disease. But we soon learned that the second most common site of the synthesis of ApoE, besides the liver, was the brain. And what was the heart disease protein doing in the brain? And so we launched an effort in order to understand how ApoE4 can lead to cognitive decline and neurodegeneration. We know now that there are selected neurons in the brain. They're deep in the brain and in a region called the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. And those cells are targeted by ApoE4. There's the generation of, you see on the slide, called ApoE4 neurotoxic fragments. They kill those cells, and in so doing, they disrupt our memories, our learning, and cause neurodegeneration. So I'll stop there, Leonard, and let you continue.
Yeah, so I think this is very important because you know, many of the efforts around ApoE have been on this side, really focusing on its capability to deposit more amyloid, which it clearly can do. But this is a very important contributor as well. And Bob and Yadong and Carl Weisgraber in the Institute developed these interesting new strategies to target this most important genetic risk factor. One is a protease that actually creates these neurotoxic fragments. That's an interesting drug target, and Yadong is working very hard on inhibiting this particular protease. And then Carl discovered together with Bob the structural impact of the E4 variant, which has a different conformation than ApoE3, and they are developing some interesting drugs that can change the conformation of ApoE4 into one that is more ApoE3-like. So those are really exciting drug development efforts for what might become the first anti-ApoE4 drugs on the market. This is an area that has clearly not been pursued as aggressively as it deserves to be pursued relative to, for example, the amyloid hypothesis. Now, another interesting feature that many people have experienced is the fact that people with Alzheimer's disease have a higher risk of developing seizure activity. And frank convulsive seizures, where people really kind of keel over and foam at the mouth and shake, are quite rare, although they happen more often in people with Alzheimer's disease than in the reference populations that have been studied. But interestingly, people with Alzheimer's disease can also get non-convulsive seizures, silent seizures that one cannot easily spot. And they have all kinds of other forms of what we call dysrhythmias, where the brain rhythms that normally support good cognition and memory become disrupted in some way. And so together with Keith Vossel, when he was in my group, and Sri Nagarayan and others in the Memory and Aging Center and the Epilepsy Center at UCSF, we embarked on a study to really ask the question, how frequent are these non-convulsive subclinical episodes in Alzheimer's disease? And we admitted people overnight, and they got EEG recordings and more complicated analyses as shown here. And remarkably, we were able to detect non-convulsive subclinical seizure activity in a very substantial proportion of people, and many of those non-convulsive seizures are quite subtle. So for example, there can be staring spells, or speech or behavioral arrest, or confusional states. That is not to say that every confusional episode in Alzheimer's disease represents a seizure, but it can in some cases, as is true also for altered consciousness. So a seizure doesn't always have to be what we imagine, but can be much more subtle. And what Keith discovered was very important, in that the people in whom we could detect this epileptiform activity, they had a much steeper decline in their cognitive functions than the people in whom we could not detect this epileptic activity. And there is an interesting clinical trial that Michaela Gallagher at Johns Hopkins is leading, where an anti-epileptic drug called levetiracetam is going to be tried in a phase 3 trial to see if preventing some of the hyperexcitability that occurs in brains might actually have a disease-modifying effect and be symptomatically beneficial. So this is currently ongoing. Now, we also discovered that this kind of network hyperexcitability in the brain was very critically related to the actions of tau, which I have mentioned. It's the main component of neurofibrillary tangles. It interacts with many proteins inside the cell, as we reviewed a while back. And the intriguing thing about this is it can exist in a dazzling array of forms, and it is really quite uncertain what form of tau is most harmful, whether it acts mainly inside the cell or from outside, which of its many chemical modifications and states are most critical, whether tau spreading from one cell to the other and spreading through the brain actually impairs neuronal functions or survival, and whether suppressing tau levels with a new approach called antisense oligonucleotide, or ASO, will be practical and safe in the long run. There is an interesting trial of this approach going on at the moment that we're excited about and are waiting for the readout. It's a good proof of concept, but I think in the long run, we believe that we need to develop small molecule compounds to reduce all these forms of tau, which will include pathogenic forms of tau. So at Gladstone, we developed a high throughput screening assay for compounds that can lower tau. You can see here neurons grown in a dish, and you can see here the tau protein that they make. That is what shows up in gray. And this compound here that we fished out of the screen nicely lowers tau while not affecting other proteins. And so we have several of those that we are developing together with Dolby Family Ventures and with the Rainwater Foundation, hopefully into better drugs that can lower tau levels. You can see here the tau lowering capacity of one of our lead hits, but we have several others, and we're embarking at the moment on drug optimization strategies as they are done to turn these compounds into what will hopefully be real therapeutics going forward. Now, let me turn to this aspect of inflammation and point out that when one looks at all these different genes that can contribute to Alzheimer's disease in a causal way, what popped up is that many of them are actually involved in immune cells and immune functions. And so I'll hand over here to Melanie, who is particularly interested in this, and she can tell us a little bit more about the work that she is doing in her postdoctoral studies.
Thank you, Leonard. So while many of these risk genes have a role in immune cell function, in particular, we were interested to study immune cells that reside in the brain. These are known as microglia. While microglia can perform many of the more, let's say, traditional roles of immune cells, such as secreting inflammatory proteins, removing invading pathogens, we are only beginning to appreciate that microglia use sophisticated and finely tuned machinery to specifically protect and maintain brain health. Some of these functions include the ability to remove protein aggregates, such as amyloid plaques. Microglia also play a role in maintaining neuronal connections. Now, neurons must be connected together in precisely wired circuits to function properly, and microglia play a critical role in protecting these connections and removing unwanted connections. Finally, microglia can also play a direct role in regulating the electrical activity of neurons. Next slide. All of these roles are protective and restorative, but in the presence of a certain toxic stimuli or environmental factors or genetic mutations, microglia can break bad. Some of these protective functions may become impaired, or they can become actively toxic to the brain. Next slide, please. Because microglia can fulfill both beneficial and detrimental functions in Alzheimer's disease, it's possible that the indiscriminate reduction of microglia or the reduction of inflammatory proteins that they secrete may be therapeutically ineffective or even exacerbate disease. Therefore, to really identify effective immune targeting therapies for Alzheimer's disease, it is critical to understand microglial functions. And specifically, we want to address a few overarching questions. First, what are the beneficial versus detrimental activities of microglia? And how and when do microglia turn bad in Alzheimer's disease? My own research is just performed in Leonard's lab and in collaboration with many of the postdocs in his group, as well as a epilepsy lab from John Paz, is looking to explore these questions, and specifically in context with microglia and neuronal activity. So we know that neuronal activity can regulate microglial functions, and conversely, microglia can regulate neuronal activity. So our question was whether this relationship actually breaks down in Alzheimer's disease. As Leonard mentioned before, dysfunctional activity of neuronal networks or epileptiform activity is a prominent feature in Alzheimer's disease. And genetic studies, as I said before, suggest a role for abnormal microglial activity. Therefore, we asked whether in Alzheimer's disease, dysfunctions in neuronal activities and immune cells, such as microglia, can engage in a vicious cycle of events which may promote cognitive loss. And on top of this, we wondered whether in different people, or we hypothesized whether in different people, these cycles may be initiated by different triggers, such as through epileptic activity or through genetic mutations. Excellent. And most importantly, we envisioned that understanding the drivers and consequences of network and immune dysfunction may actually help identify therapeutic interventions which disrupt this vicious loop and hopefully slow, prevent, and reverse cognitive decline. Thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it back to Leonard.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melanie. So let me come toward the end by giving you an outlook of how I think we're going to end up treating Alzheimer's disease. It will require much more work on many fronts, but if we think about other complicated diseases such as preventing atherosclerosis, strokes and heart attacks, for example, we need to combine many different strategies. So for example, if we have somebody who has high blood lipids and high blood pressure and diabetes, in order to prevent strokes and heart attacks in that individual, it's not enough to just treat the high blood pressure. We also have to go after the lipids. We have to treat the blood glucose. And all these drugs have different mechanisms of action. So my prediction is that we are going to have to treat Alzheimer's disease in a similar way. We may need drugs targeting amyloid, tau, ApoE4, possibly modulators of neural network activity, such as some of those that I've listed. And a big question that is often asked is whether lifestyle modifications might help, just as we know they do in atherosclerosis. And I think our general take in this group is that, you know, what's good for the heart is probably good for the brain, but at the moment, it is not really proven that any specific lifestyle modification or diet clearly changes the risk or course of the disease, at least in my view. There are inklings of it. They are worth pursuing. It's a good idea to live healthy lives, but we don't have anything yet that clearly modifies the risk of the disease in a way that one can easily measure and replicate. And that's what we need to go for. So how are we going to do it? One path that is tried and true is that academia identifies targets, it validates drug targets, it develops some assays, identifies biomarkers, validates them, and then transfers them to industry where things are scaled up and where actually therapeutics are made and toxicity is assessed to actually turn what is a compound, a chemical compound, into a therapeutic that can be safely given to millions of people for years on end. And that is tested in very rigorously designed preclinical and clinical trials. Now, this works very well, and most of the drugs that we currently benefit from, for example, anti-HIV drugs or statins or certain cancer drugs, have emerged from this machine. But what has happened in Alzheimer's disease and other brain disorders is that, unfortunately, we've seen much of the big pharmaceutical industry drop out of making drugs for Alzheimer's disease because it's so complicated, so costly, and so high risk. And so we at Gladstone feel a great responsibility to fill this gap. And so how can you do this? So I think, our comfort zone tends to be in the scientific discovery side. And that is fueled by federal funding from the NIH, by the state, by wonderful foundations such as the Alzheimer's Association, the Schwab Foundation, and then by private donors. And we've been very fortunate to have wonderful support from private donors who are fully committed to allowing us to carry out high risk and high reward research. But then how do we get this over into the creation of spin-out industrial partnerships that can see this to the finish line? So we've been very entrepreneurial at the Institute to try to come up with new mechanisms to bridge this gap. And we believe that innovative business models that engage this new ecosystem are absolutely critical to draw in venture philanthropy, technologies, give our investigators access to medicinal chemistry so that we can de-risk certain targets and strategies to the point where they become attractive and we can bring back large pharma partners after doing the de-risking. So this has worked quite well, and even though we are a relatively small institution, we have spun out quite a number of companies, and notably several of them are focused on very Alzheimer-related missions. And so we are very excited about their efforts and will follow this with great interest and are hopeful that through these mechanisms and many others, we will come up with better treatments for this very difficult condition. Ultimately, defeating the disease and other complex brain diseases will require diverse disciplines and initiatives, all of them and more that I have listed here. And I think it's been incredibly gratifying to me to see that the field has diversified its approach. It has recognized that we have to do it in partnerships between academia and industry and partnerships across countries. And all of this is actually happening, and we just want to see more of. And I think that it is really those large-scale synergies that are going to bring us the answers that we so desperately need in this space. So I will stop here and hand it over back to Bob.
Okay, thank you all. Thank all the panelists for your comments. And we have a large number of questions, far more than we can possibly answer in the time that we have. And so we've picked out a few that seem to be those of interest to many of you. And I'm going to start with Susan. Susan, you talked about the toll on caregivers. You talked about the fact that there are 29 million caretakers in the United States, at least. It's often said that there are two victims of Alzheimer's disease, the patient, of course, but then the family. The questions are, how do caretakers take care of themselves? And are there support groups and mechanisms that have been helpful to you? These questions come from caretakers in our audience.
A caretaker comes in many different flavors. I'm a caretaker, I'm 61. I have met many children, teenagers that are caretakers, that's mother or father has early onset Alzheimer's. The spouse has had to quit their day job to take care of the loved one with Alzheimer's, and the kids have to come and quit sports and come home and take care of their loved one that has Alzheimer's so that the other one can go to work to make ends meet, to put food on the table. I have seen so many people impacted. I know personally of a lady that lived in Northern California and husband had early onset Alzheimer's, and had to move and could not afford to live and had to move somewhere where she could find somehow to work and take care of her husband. There are a lot of resources, and the Alzheimer's Association provides an incredible amount of resources for caretakers, support groups, and I would encourage everyone to reach out. It's a very lonely disease, and part of my initiative and my goal in life is to take the stigma away from Alzheimer's. There became a point that my mother was embarrassed to go out with my dad because there was no filter. Mm-hmm. And there's so many people, 29 million in the country and growing every minute. So the faster we can find a cure. And I'm so encouraged from today's presentation, Leonard, that was beautiful. And Melanie, thank you. And Bob for moderating, but that is such encouraging news. So we really thank you for that.
Susan, one more question I'll pose to you as what were the steps involved for you and your mother in making the decision and finding the place?
It was the hardest decision I ever have made in my life, and I hope no one ever has to make it. My father transitioned pretty rapidly and took a big step down. We had made all the we had made the decision to keep him at home and to bring help in. And he became very angry and would always gravitate towards my mother because he knew her and she was familiar. And we made a family decision, which was the hardest decision I've ever made, is to put him into a home because it was really, it was taking a toll on my mother. I was very concerned about my mother's own health. And we chose Kensington because they are dedicated memory care, and we knew that he could move in and he could stay there. There's many different levels of care that they have, and they have taken care of my father exceptionally well. Obviously, he's been there 4 years, but they've also really cared for my mother. She, before COVID, she would join him every day for lunch.
And I would actually also like to add to this a little bit. I have, seen these struggles that you're describing in many families, and I've often addressed their guilt feelings that they really have by pointing out to them that if they want to preserve the love that they have for their relative, they sometimes must take the step because the difficult behaviors, the paranoia that can come with the disease, the nightly disruptions can create a level of stress that no person can really cope with. And that erodes the caretaker's relationship with the patient in ways that sometimes, can add to the whole scenario in tragic ways. And so I think by finding a good home and putting a little bit of distance between oneself and this tragic development, it can help one relate to the person who is in the home better and with less direct impact. So it's really an important consideration.
You bring up a really good point. Guilt is a very scary word in the Alzheimer's world.
Yes.
So thank you for saying that, because you shouldn't have it, and you need to do a lot of times to protect your own health.
Yes. Well, thank you, Susan.
Thank you
very much. Leonard, there are several questions related to the fact that I think it probably deserves a little bit more discussion. And that is, isn't there anything that we can do if we know that we are at risk of Alzheimer's disease? Isn't there something that we can do to slow or prevent the process? And the questions are, aren't there lifestyle things that we should be doing until we get a drug?
Yeah, so that's a question, obviously, that is discussed very widely and that comes up very often. And, there have been many epidemiological studies and even some more prospective studies looking at physical exercise and, that look really like there are some good signals suggesting that staying physically active and engaged is probably a good thing. If you have a strong genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, personally, I doubt that you're going to conquer this with just physical exercise. And then, there's some evidence that, for example, taking anti-inflammatory drugs for long periods of time might reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. But then in the prospective trials that have been done have failed. That is in people who already have the disease. So the question is it too little, too late? There are all kinds of dietary claims that, things might work. I always feel impressed by the fact that, different populations across the world have very different diets, as you know very well, having studied diets in relation to heart disease all over the world. And, if you think about the Japanese diet versus the Western diet and so on, yet they all get Alzheimer's disease. So if diet really had such a huge impact, I would expect to see more signals. But certainly, people explore different things, but as far as I read the literature, there is no lifestyle intervention that has been firmly proven in a way that can be replicated on a large scale to change the course or the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So we're still waiting for this. And, I would think it's likely that it will have an effect, but it will probably be smaller than we need it. We need something as powerful as the anti-HIV drugs and as some cancer drugs for this formidable illness. And so I doubt that dietary or lifestyle modifications are going to do the trick. I wish they would. And I think it's worth exploring further in very rigorously designed placebo-controlled trials. But I don't think we have anything that I could firmly recommend to anybody at this stage.
Okay, I like very much the statement that you made, and I agree with you. The proof is not there. The hard facts are not there for lifestyle. But I do hold out a hope, maybe more of a hope than you do, that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Control your blood pressure, your cholesterol, exercise, diabetes control, and so forth. I am an optimist in that regard, and I recommend it. But of course, you're right. The facts.
I think, there is no question that that's what one should do. I do it, all of the above. So
Okay, we have only time for one more question, and a couple of you can chime in on this. But what do you think is going to be the major breakthrough in treating Alzheimer's disease? The question is, where will it come from, and when is it going to happen?
Yeah, so I think, I feel that the diversified approach that we see, that we're not only targeting amyloid, but also going after tau, going after ApoE and bad inflammation, makes me very hopeful that we're going to see breakthroughs coming from this multi-pronged attack onto a multi-causal disease. So I feel strongly that that's the right way. Now, in the early 90s, many of my colleagues and I were convinced that the disease was going to be conquered within 5 to 10 years. So we've been humbled as a field and as individual investigators by the colossal late-stage clinical trial failures. So I will not put a timeline on this because it has been so capricious and difficult to truly prove that something works. And I should point out, how easy it is to be misled. I mean, we've seen marvelous results from phase 2 trials and even sometimes from smaller phase 3 trials, only to see them go up in flames in a large phase 3 trial later on that was really you know, including a very diverse population of patients. So it's a tough one, but I think we're on the right track.
I agree with you. I think we are, and the time frame, I certainly hope, is no longer than 5 years. There are so many people, too many people waiting for us. And of course, I don't have to tell you or others involved in this, we've got to do it, or we're going to break our healthcare system with an aging population. We must be successful, and we must be successful more rapidly than we are at the present time. Well, I'm sorry that our time is up for the questions. I know there are many, many more questions. I'm terribly sorry that we can't get to all of your questions, but I would now like to bring Joanne Hubbard back in and have her give some closing remarks. I'll remind you that she is the Executive Director of Kensington Place in Redwood City. Joanne, please join us now.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure listening to all of your research, and most of all for instilling hope in a community that has not had a lot of hope. There's been hope for a long term, maybe generations down, but the idea of, hey, maybe in 5 years is just so reassuring. And we are in the business at Kensington Senior Living and Kensington Place in particular as a dedicated memory care. We're in the business of caring for those that are dealing with Alzheimer's and other types of dementia now. We are here in the meantime to enable people to live a dignified quality life. Our promise is to love and care for our seniors as if they're our own family. And we try to do that in various ways. And we are still committed to funding and finding a cure, finding treatments that are effective. As Susan mentioned, you know, there's no place for guilt. Leonard mentioned the guilt. It's something that is so prevalent among family members and loved ones. And our role is to help family members get back to being family. Allow you to be the family again, and let us be the caregiver. And together we can provide a quality life for our residents. I'd like to thank our sponsoring partner, Total Care Services, who partners with us in our caregiving and in our funding of research and treatments. And I would like to thank all of you for taking the time and sharing your expertise with our friends and families and audience of folks that are always looking for more information. We need you. We need you doing this work. It's important work. Thank you for not forgetting about those with Alzheimer's. Thank you for focusing on people with dementia, because we need this research. We can make a better life for people. And so with that, we are, as a company, we are so proud of your work, and we are donating for Gladstone Institute $5,000 to your research. So we thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
You want to go ahead and close, Leonard, please?
Yes, yeah. So I think, as I said before, I can guarantee that my colleagues and I will not rest until better treatments become available for this and related major brain diseases. This is our mission. We will keep walking, and we appreciate all the support that we have received from folks, and you know, the support can come in many different ways. It can be direct financial support of our efforts. It can be partnerships in different ways. It can be calling your congressperson and lobbying for more federal support for Alzheimer funding. So we can all do something to really make this give. And so please join us in whichever way you can do it. It is great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We thank the audience.